for participating. I know this is a terribly hectic time for many of you, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to come and join your colleagues in this conversation. We really hope that you are all safe and that those you care deeply about are also safe. We're sorry we can't do this in person, but we look forward to potentially seeing you face to face at a meeting that we'll schedule the first part of next year, Lord willing. And we're currently thinking of going to Baltimore because they were so gracious to host us this time. But wherever we meet, we know that it'll be exciting because you all will be there. I want to start out with just a few brief comments about where we are on some key things, and then I'm going to hand this over to Leanne to really talk about the meat of the presentation today. First, I really want to let you know that Leanne and the team, in partnership with members of the leadership team, are working very hard on a proposal to Doris Duke. They've agreed to give us some funding over the next 3 years to continue and transition the fellowship to its new form. There's several components to the proposal that we're doing. I'm just going to touch on them briefly. A big 30,000-foot level view of it. We're planning to continue with the Research to Action grant program. We'll probably have a couple of rounds of those over the next 3 years. And we look forward, as you're going to see from this effort, it's a real opportunity for fellows to work with direct service providers and those that are really in a position to make the best use of our data. So we're looking forward to continuing that program. Secondly, we are going to have a celebration of form to celebrate all the good work you've been doing. The foundation feels very insistent that we have a party of some kind. We're trying to structure it not just a party, but a really learning opportunity. And again, we hope you'll all join us, and that will be sometime in 2021. Third, we're going to be spending a lot of time over the next few years transitioning the fellowship to its new form. That's going to be involving a new fiscal home or primary partnership to the fellowship, as well as a variety of partners that can work with fellows in implementing some of the tasks we think are really essential to making the fellowship what it is. Things like making sure we have strategic research dissemination and opportunities for research collaborations among all of you and your growing base of colleagues. We want to expand the fellowship, bring more people into the network so they can experience some of the same positive experiences you all have had. We'll be supporting a variety of activities that may be peer mentoring programs, writing retreats. It's unclear exactly what those activities will be, but they're going to be things that you're familiar with and things that we know have worked in help strengthening your network as well as improving your work. In addition to that, we're going to be looking for organizations that can, one, serve as the fiscal home for the fellowship, much the way Chapin Hall has, but also think about other partners that may be out there to work on specific activities. The proposal will also include ongoing infrastructure support, and then finally an evaluation component. We really want to continue to document the impacts of the fellowship, the strength of the network, and the kinds of meaningful impacts you're having on your own careers, the field in general, and of course, families and children. You may have some questions about what we're doing on that. We don't have time to talk about it in great depth today, but if you have questions, put them in the chat box, and Leanne and I and Mickey will get back to you with as clear an answer as we can possibly provide. So in addition to the proposal, I wanted to touch on two other things briefly. One is to let you know that we're working with Prevent Child Abuse America over the next several months to really serve as a venue for bringing together a lot of the work you all are doing in response to the COVID crisis. Things that you had to change in your workforce. It may be research projects, it may be materials you've already pulled together for families and practitioners working in the field right now. Putting that in a central place, working in partnership with the PCA chapters, and really begin to think not just about telling a story about what's happening now, but more important, getting to tease out our current experiences so that we can do a better job of serving families going forward. I don't anticipate we will have a pandemic every year, at least I hope we won't, but we will have disruptions to our system. And I think the lessons we're learning now about how flexible you need to be, how programs have to be structured, how research has to be structured, are all important lessons for going forward. So this project will have three primary goals. It'll disseminate in a timely manner the information and promising interventions that we're identifying, thinking about always with an eye to preventing child abuse. Apply these lessons that we're learning to strengthen the overall effectiveness of the prevention field, and then to use it to establish and increase the availability of partnerships between fellows and a variety of PCA chapters and events. So I'm going to ask Bart if he has anything to add to that. We're still in the planning stages, but we are moving forward with it.
I think I would just reiterate that we're excited to make this partnership work, that, you know, what we're finding from our state chapters and even through our Healthy Families America network is that the field has completely changed, and we're finding ourselves in kind of a new circumstance, and that even when we get back to a sense of what we think is normalcy, when restrictions are lifted, that there are things that we've learned now that can improve our systems moving forward. And, you know, we're looking forward to working with everyone in the fellowship to create those products and get them as disseminated as widely as we can.
Great, thanks, Bart. And this is the kind of partnerships with other organizations that I'm really hoping you'll take to heart and look to your own institutions and others where we can really draw on the fellowship-specific skills and marry them with a set of skills that others may have. The one final point I want to make, I tried to do the good citizen thing and let you all know that Doris Duke was doing a series of webinars the month of May, every Thursday, on a variety of aspects of the COVID crisis. What does it mean for families? What does it mean for direct service providers? What does it mean for system building? What does it mean for research? And I know many of you were very interested in signing up. There was a little glitch in the email. I have talked to the foundation. We're working it out. We're going to get you another message shortly. For those of you that have signed up, some of you have gotten confirmations, and some of your confirmations have come to my email box. So there's still a little bit of a glitch in how this link is working, but we're hoping we can clear it up, because I know the foundation would love to have you all and colleagues you work with participate in this effort. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leanne to sort of frame the core message we're presenting today.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you, Bart. And thanks to everybody that is on the webinar today. I'm so bummed that we're not all in person together in Baltimore. Erica, Lewis, and the planning team had an amazing program planned. So we do hope that we'll be able to reschedule that with them again. I also want to thank the Research to Action grantees. When we called this a pilot round, it really is a pilot round this first time. I appreciate so much everyone's generosity in sharing their thoughts and lessons about how this project went. And we're very excited that the foundation is interested in investing in additional rounds of these grants. I am not going to take up much time. I wanted to remind everybody that let's all be patient as we make sure the technology works on this. Nikki has done an amazing job pulling all this together and trying to manage technology of, I don't even know how many, 12 people, 10 people. That's not an easy task. So thanks to Nikki for that. We are going to hear from the three teams today. We're starting with Carly Dierkhising's team, and I'll let her introduce her group. Then we'll move to Judith Scott and her project. And then the last project is a collaboration with Dan Busso, Natalia, and Scott Delaney. Remember, the goals of the Research to Action projects were to really to provide direct support for applied research projects, where you tried to answer some really specific questions that your partners had, to work on translation and dissemination of the work, which is really, the teams are really starting that process now, and then to really develop fellow skills in project leadership and applied research. So let's get started. Carly Dierkhising that team is gonna start, and I'll let Carly explain what they're doing. It's very exciting. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to share this project with everyone today. I just really enjoyed being able to participate in this Research to Action grant, and ours was focused on safe and stable housing for youth with histories of commercial sexual exploitation. Really, one of the things that was great about this grant for us is the timing of it when it came out. We had just finished a very large research study on housing and services for exploited youth here in Los Angeles, which resulted in 8 overarching or broad recommendations that we submitted to the Board of Supervisors here in Los Angeles. And right after we submitted that, we were able to submit for this grant. And what that allowed us to do is, rather than letting that research report sit on people's shelves, we were actually able to dig deeper and think very strategically about how we can actually implement those research recommendations in meaningful ways here in Los Angeles. So I just want to thank my awesome team. So Andy Eastman and Natalia Orendane, who provided some research support, Jacqueline Sandoval, who was our junior scholar and made our summit possible, and then especially also to May Ackerman-Brimberg, who is my policy partner at the National Center for Youth Law, whose video is not working, so you can't see her today, but she is here, and I'll transition to her when I'm done. So if we can go to the next slide, I can give you, show you what the 3 objectives of the study were for. So first of all, we wanted to do some follow-up administrative data analysis. So we had a cohort of probation-involved youth from that prior research report where half of them had experienced exploitation and half of them had not. And we wanted to look and see if they also had histories in child welfare and look at what those histories look like. So ultimately identifying the incidence of dual system youth among this sample. We also were interested in surveying out-of-home care staff. So mostly service providers in group homes here in Los Angeles, because one of the things we found from the prior research, many youth in the surveys and in interviews talked about frustrations with the staff in the group homes. And so we wanted to make sure we also heard their perspective and hear what those challenges were and successes were, as well as their perceptions around working with youth who had been exploited. And then finally, and really the biggest part of this project was putting on the Research to Action Summit, where we brought together over 70 key stakeholders here in Los Angeles, but we also had folks from across the country who we invited who had been doing work around this issue. And that summit was for the purpose of developing an action plan that really dug into those 8 different recommendations from the prior report and identified very specific practice and policy action items that the county can implement. So next slide, I'll give you just a quick overview of the findings from the administrative data. So just as a reminder, these were all youth with a history of out-of-home care. So they were kind of more deeply involved in the system, and they all had a history in probation. So they had been adjudicated of some criminal offense. And what we found is that almost all of them, whether they'd been exploited or not, or identified as exploited, were dual system youth. So 98% and 94% of the 2 subsamples. And typically among a sample of probation youth, you would typically see about 2/3 of the youth being dual system youth. But we believe that these rates are much higher because we were only looking at youth who experienced out-of-home care, which is also tends to be one of the ways they get funneled into the justice system. So in terms of their child welfare histories, they were about 6 years old on average at the time of their first maltreatment report. Both of the groups averaged between 7 and 8 maltreatment allegations across childhood and adolescence. And but those with a history of exploitation were more likely to have experienced multiple allegations. And then in terms of their out-of-home care histories, those who had experienced exploitation had significant more placement changes compared to those who had not experienced exploitation. And what we found in our prior work is that these out-of-home care experiences are linked to the risk for exploitation and really increases their vulnerability for exploitation. And other research shows that as well. We didn't really look at when the exploitation occurred in terms of their out-of-home care history. So it's just a limitation to keep in mind. And then one of the things we looked at was the cross-system identification, and really which highlights this need for cross-system collaboration, because we found that not all the youth that were identified by one system as having experienced exploitation, and even though they were dual system youth, the other system did not know that exploitation was in their history. Now, it's possible that they might have experienced exploitation after coming into the probation system, for instance, but I think this statistic here is striking. About 2/3 of the youth who had been identified as having experienced exploitation by probation had not been identified as having experienced exploitation by the child welfare system. So the next slide is the main findings of the survey of out-of-home care staff. Now I'm going to go through this really quickly because sadly we only had on this survey, but I did want to just mention we developed a really great survey. We spent a lot of time on this survey. It really a lot of questions around their support of trauma-informed care, the actual trauma-informed practices that their agency may not be doing, as well as perceptions around working with exploited youth. So if anybody's interested in seeing the survey or maybe doing a similar survey, maybe you could use some of it, be happy to share that. But ultimately, we were only able to send emails to the administrators and rely on them to send emails to the line staff. And I just don't think that those emails frequently were passed along. And if we had more time and money, we definitely would have spent time to actually go to the group homes and get in front of the service providers and have them fill out the surveys, for instance, like during a night shift or during a time where they had a bit more time to do so. So next slide, just real quickly, the Research to Action Summit. So as I said, this was really kind of the biggest piece of this project. And the summit was amazing. We spent a very busy day together, and really it was a working meeting. So nearly the whole day was structured around these breakout sessions. And all of the breakout sessions focus on one of these different themes. And these themes were, again, from those 8 recommendations from the prior research. And we had a diverse representation of stakeholders in the room to have really specific discussions about what do we do about this? What is a specific practice? What is a specific policy that we can recommend to probation and DCFS and the Board of Supervisors in order to better support our youth in care who've experienced exploitation? And so the action plan is centered around these 8 themes. And I'm going to hand it over now to May Ackerman-Brimberg, who's going to give you an example of just one of those, one of the themes from the action plan, which once we're done with that, very soon, next month, we'll definitely be sending it out to all the fellows. And I'll also be happy to share the link to the prior research that I keep referencing as well. All right, May.
Thanks, Carly. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm sorry that I can't be on video, but working from home, tech problems. But again, my name is May Ackerman-Brimberg. I'm an attorney at the National Center for Youth Law. We're based in Oakland, California, and I focus on our commercial sexual exploitation initiative. So you can go on to the next slide. As Carly mentioned, I'm going to be spending some time talking about the action plan, which was a culmination of both our original research report that Carly mentioned, as well as the Research to Action Summit. And the goal of both the summit and the action plan is to translate the findings of our research, plus the tremendous amount of stakeholder input that we gathered at the summit, into tangible, actionable items that LA County can implement to better serve and support children and youth who've experienced commercial sexual exploitation. So we focused at the summit and in our action plan on changes both at the service provider level, the county agency level, and also statewide levels, to the extent that there's kind of feedback between local and state level policy. And so much useful information came out of the research and out of the summit that we really are being kind of over-inclusive in the action plan, recognizing this is a bit more of a wish list or kind of an aspirational document that the county can use over the next few years to plan how they change and improve their services. So we do have action items for each of the 8 recommendations, but I'll just talk through kind of one of them now, and hopefully we'll share it with you all later. So a big theme of our research, as Carly mentioned, is the high level of system involvement, which also often includes a very high level of trauma among youth who have been impacted by commercial sexual exploitation. And this is trauma both before exploitation as a result of child abuse and family separation and other things, and also as a result of exploitation itself. So our first recommendation really focused on creating and expanding trauma-informed systems and services within LA County. Now, this is, of course, a huge kind of broad recommendation. So our action plan tries to get specific about what the county can do to implement those changes. So one example is formalizing and standardizing the trauma assessment and screening processes. So we know that youth who've experienced trauma, but without a kind of uniform system using validated tools that are shared across different agencies, it's really hard to gauge true prevalence as well as true or highlighting youth-specific needs. And having standardized processes also reduces re-traumatization of youth by eliminating the need for multiple agencies to ask youth the same questions over and over. Another example of a specific action item is shoring up the trauma-informed services within existing specialized units in probation and the child welfare agencies that are dedicated to serving youth impacted by exploitation. So we suggest embedding in those units specialized mental health clinicians and case managers that can provide brief trauma interventions, connect to trauma-informed treatments and supports in the community, provide psychoeducation to youth, support staff. And the last kind of tangible example here, which seems really obvious, but does not exist in LA or in many other jurisdictions, is just creating a complete list and regularly updating that list of who the trauma-informed treatment providers in the community are, which both helps to connect youth with those services that they need and also helps to highlight gaps in the county's service array. So I could talk about the action plan for hours, but that's just a really small snapshot. You can go on to the next slide. I'm going to transition us to talking about some of the lessons learned from this process. And there are many. In terms of how our organization is using or plans to use the findings, the first kind of big piece is just that our previous research, or much previous research, ours and others, showed the strong overlap between exploitation and system history in both juvenile justice and child welfare. And this data showed us just how strong that correlation is. This helps us to understand vulnerabilities for exploitation. It also drives home the responsibility of these public agency system partners in identifying and better supporting youth impacted by exploitation. The survey that Carly described, again, really highlighted the need to better engage line workers and direct service providers in the solutions. And the challenges that we had in getting participation in the survey, I think also really is around resources, coverage for shifts when we're asking staff to do trainings or other kind of side tasks, and access to technology, which I think prevented some participation. From the summit, we were really excited to learn there was a ton of interest and a strong desire for collaboration. The tricky part, of course, and the reason we are excited about this grant is because people really want those collaborative experiences to follow with actionable steps. So we tried to partner with some of the stakeholders in developing the action plan so that we could keep that ongoing connection and feedback loop with our collaborative partners. And then lastly, the need for accountability measures to be built into any action plan. So a number of the action items that we developed, the county partners kind of told us, well, we've already got a policy about that. And what we're learning is that we need to build in true accountability measures so that those policies are translating into practice, both because staff need to be better trained on them, and also the county needs to do more of kind of checking in on what their policies are and making sure they're happening. And then next slide, please. In terms of what we have learned kind of from this research partnership more generally and the process, it's been incredibly helpful to be able to couple our advocacy efforts with direct research findings. And this is for a couple of reasons. It's both to ensure that we as an advocacy organization are devoting our attention and resources to the issues that will most impact kids and young people, and use that information to drive our recommendations and advocacy. And it also brings legitimacy in the eyes of others to our work. As we presented this information and this research across the state and the country, folks were really hungry for this type of research. And we found that we kind of, we were able to document a lot of things that folks kind of knew or felt anecdotally, but having it proven in the research really helped. And there have been more and more resources dedicated to developing programs for youth impacted by exploitation. And people, again, are really hungry for this information so that they can be devoting resources and building out programs that have been proven to work. Kind of switching gears a little bit, we learned a lot about kind of researchers and lawyers, advocates, different roles and strengths. Our organization has been working with Carly and her team for almost 3 years now, and we've learned a ton about how to communicate, how to divide tasks depending on our strengths, how to kind of push back if we're crossing boundaries. And it's been honestly just really fun and a big learning experience. And then lastly, kind of more organization-wide, there's been a broad interest within our organization to couple research with advocacy kind of in our other projects as well, but folks don't necessarily know how to do it. So finding researchers, how to fund the project, kind of sequencing research with advocacy are all questions that people are asking us now, our team, since we have some experience with it. But I think that there's just real opportunity to develop that more broadly throughout the different work that we're doing. And I'll just say lastly, overall, this has been a really powerful and again, fun experience for me and our whole team. And on behalf of NCLE, National Center for Youth Law, we just want to thank our research partners, Carly specifically, and also Doris Duke for supporting this ongoing partnership. And I'm going to turn it back to Carly for some lessons learned and final words on her end.
Yes, thank you, May. So if we can go to the final slide, I can just talk a little bit about the lessons learned from the kind of academic perspective. I just have like 2 minutes, so I'm going to be pretty quick in going through this, because I think really this just validated some of the things that I already knew. Really, the fact is that doing applied research and field work, I find it to be so much more rewarding, but ultimately it is a lot more work. It's always more work than you expect it to be, no matter what. But that is why partnering with NCLE has been so amazing, because they are really that intermediary, since they are the one that actually focuses on implementing the policies. So they make, so like I said, I don't feel like the research is actually sitting on the shelf. Like, they are actually using it in their advocacy, and that is even more rewarding. And then in terms of the youth voice, obviously this is something I've always known is really important, but I feel like I've learned so much from the NCLE perspective and from the advocates about how to actually raise that voice up in the research and center it in the work rather than just giving it lip service. Which I think happens often. And then just obviously there is just such a need to adapt to shifting priorities. Applied research is so dynamic. You really have to be able to adapt at a moment's notice to shifting priorities. And this can mean, you know, changing pieces of the vision of the project, or changing what that deliverable looks like, or your dissemination strategy, or really it could be anything. But ultimately, without being agile and able to adapt, you just can't be as useful to the agencies. So when they reach out and they change their mind, or they need something different, or their priority shifted, if you can adapt, then your usefulness to them is decreased. And then also that the partnership, I think, just isn't as strong. And then finally, just the politics of policy research. I'm kind of trying to be a little funny about that, but you know, we didn't go to grad school to be politicians, but when you start to do a lot of this work, public agencies are really driven and run by policymakers. So probation and DCFS are, they have to be accountable to the Board of Supervisors. And our original research was mandated and funded by the board. So that provided a lot of accountability, but this project wasn't. But again, that's why Nickel was so important in making sure that the partnership continued to be strong. But really, as researchers, or at least for myself, I don't really care about the politics. I don't like to get involved on that end. But as the more I do applied research, the more I realize, you know, you do have to learn to play the game a little bit. And that is about kind of to these other points about adapting to the shifting priorities and collaborating and strengthening those partnerships. So I think I'm just out of time. So I think we are going to open it up for Q&A. So I'm going to hand it back over to Leanne and Nikki.
Thanks, Carly. We have two questions that we've gotten in so far. Folks, you can, we're not going to open it up to everyone to try to talk because it just causes more problems, or it's too messy and complicated, but you can type your questions in and we'll read them out. So Carly and May, the two questions are, one is, and it sounds like your research wasn't specifically about this, but someone asked what kind of capacity there is to treat youth who have been trafficked. You talked in the action plan, the recommendation number 1 that May talked about trying to embed specialized mental health clinicians. So the question is really just about the capacity of the county to actually, do you actually have that capacity? And then I'll just ask the second one and then let you all answer. The second one is more about, you all have been working together for a few years. How did that start? How did you all start working together? You, Carly, as a researcher with an advocacy and policy organization.
Okay, so I'll take the first stab, and May, you can kind of fill in what I missed. But one of the things we just didn't really have a lot of time to talk about in terms of the capacity of the county, or at least the agencies. So both the probation department and the child welfare system, or DCFS here, they both have specialized units for youth who've been impacted by sexual exploitation. And particularly on the probation side, their child trafficking unit has been around for a number of years, I think since 2012. And really the director of that department has been on the forefront of a lot of this work across the nation to better support youth impacted by exploitation. So they already have these specialized units that have a different type of training, different mandates for how they interact with youth. So for instance, on the probation end, their program is much more developed than on the DCFS side, but they interact with youth, I don't know, it's like almost like every day. And when we interviewed youth and we talked to them about their probation officers in the child trafficking unit, they love them. You know, they talk about them being like family, them truly caring about them. And that obviously is not something you typically hear from youth when they're talking about their probation officer. So there's capacity that they've been building within the county within these agencies for a really long time. There's actually a number of initiatives around trafficking here in Los Angeles. For instance, every county worker is supposed to get like a CSEC 101 course. So I think really our work with the action plan has been about, okay, yeah, there's like these policies that are going on and there's all these different things going on, but like what's working, what's not, and where can we improve? So hopefully that answered that question. May, do you want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, that was pretty thorough, but just to follow up, LA County has been really focused on this issue since about 2011. As Carly mentioned, they have specialized units within both child welfare and probation. They also have specialized courts, both on the dependency and delinquency side, that youth can be referred to. They've got, as Carly mentioned, really broad training mandates, which has been possible because of attention from the Board of Supervisors and a willingness to fund that. And then also, one of the other things our organization has worked with the county on is a number of multidisciplinary protocols, including the law enforcement first responder protocol, which was put into place before the law changed in California, such that young people can no longer be arrested for prostitution. But prior to that, the county decided they didn't want to be arresting kids for prostitution. So we helped them to develop an alternative process that's a collaborative service-based model. And we've developed a similar model within the juvenile halls for identifying youth who have been exploited. And we are currently working on one for youth who are called to testify as victim witnesses against their exploiters in criminal proceedings. So there's tons of work going on in LA around this issue. And our organization is also helping to put together some materials and reports that outline really the range of those initiatives. So if you're interested in that, they should be coming out in the next couple of months, and I'm happy to share that with folks as well.
Yeah, and then perfect segue, I think, to the next question, and then I'll hand it back over to you, May. But because the Board of Supervisors has invested a lot of energy, resources, and so on into this issue in Los Angeles, because the need is so great here in Los Angeles, that is actually how this partnership began. So the Board of Supervisors had a motion put forward for in-depth research on housing and services for youth impacted by sexual exploitation. And that is how we ended up getting connected. So a colleague of mine actually does a lot of research for the county. She wasn't able to do it, so she had referred it to me. And so that's how the partnership began for that original project. And then, like I said, then the Research to Action grant came out. We applied for that. And then actually during or before even, in the midst of this also, we also applied for a federal NIJ grant, which we also received and just started a few months ago, that is continuing or building on this work as well. So May is not getting rid of me anytime soon.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other piece to that, which is we've alluded to it, but kind of the importance of leveraging and getting people excited at the county leadership level about this issue. And excited maybe is the wrong word, but committed, because all of this is resource intensive. It requires money, but it also just requires a commitment and a kind of willingness to let agency leadership who want to focus on this issue, like Michelle Guyman, who's the director of the child trafficking unit, to kind of take it and run with it. So a lot of what this has required is that kind of politics of policy research, which is really making sure we're keeping folks engaged throughout and showing them why this is important and how it's going to make sure that they're spending their dollars and their attention and their resources in the right places.
Great. We have two quick questions. You guys have about 2 minutes left. And then we'll move to the next team. Did you provide recommendations for specific trauma exposure screening measures that agencies should use? And the second one is, have you considered how you'll go about compiling the list of trauma-informed providers?
So really good questions. We are including a couple references, the list of screens, because ultimately this is actually what me and May have been struggling with ever since to finish the action plan, is that it's not up to us right now to actually implement these action items, that the agencies actually need to do that and figure out what is the best trauma screen for which point of contact are we going to be using it. And that might depend on which screen they use and so on, right? And that is actually what May and Nicole, that is the work that they do. So the action plan, probation and DCFS intend to integrate probably not all, but at least as many items as they can into their strategic plan that they have to report to the Board of Supervisors about over, I think, probably like the next couple of years, so they can try to actually address and implement specific action items. So we are trying to be as succinct as possible and recognize that ultimately the county needs to make some executive decisions about how certain things are implemented.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carly and May.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I forgot to tell everyone this at the beginning, but Mickey sent a message out. You can send us chats or questions. I don't know what box shows up on your GoToWebinar thing, but you can send us those throughout. We'll hopefully have time at the end of each team's presentation to ask questions specific to them, and then we have built-in time at the end to ask questions, kind of a free-for-all for anybody. So I'm going to quickly introduce Judith Scott. She's the PI of the next Research to Action grant. And Judith, you can introduce your team and Yo-Yo, and you guys can take it from there.
Thank you, Leanne. So thank you all for coming today, especially during this really crazy time. I appreciate you saving some space to hear what we've been doing for the last year. So first, I kind of want to introduce my team because I feel like everything starts there. So as you can see, my community partner, Yoyo, who's Director of Programming for Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, is here with me, and she'll be providing part of this presentation. But I also, as you can see from the pitch for the slide, there are a lot of people that were involved in making this happen. So working with Julia and Bridget has been a great experience and absolutely wonderful. Along with Yo-Yo, Giles Lee, who was the previous executive director, was also heavily involved, and even now being in the Bar Foundation, who still continues to do so. And then, of course, the on-the-ground staff that without data collection, analysis, reduction presentations wouldn't happen without them. Yan Yi, Jia Yi, Callie, Kendall, Jehan, and Shen. All of them were really crucial to this project. So as we also kind of people mentioned, is that when you start with this project, you have this vision of what you think will happen, and then the project happens to you. And then you kind of see how it plays out. So I ended up doing about 4 different focus groups, kind of exploring 3 different objectives. The first one was to understand how Chinese immigrant caregivers conceptualize supportive, harsh, and abusive parenting. The second was to understand the contextual influences on their parenting and how they respond to them. And lastly, their recommendations for service providers and what they need to provide healthy and supportive parenting for their children. So around 24 caregivers came to these focus groups. They were conducted in Mandarin and Cantonese. They were about 2 hours long. I will say that they were the most joyful research experiences I've ever had. Parents got really into answering the questions, sometimes asking us questions about why we were asking that question, as well as kind of being very vocal about the want for kind of more spaces to talk about parenting and to talk to different experts. From that, our team then translated and transcribed these focus groups into transcripts, and we finished our initial analysis for this. However, our dissemination plan has kind of hit some snags because of the pandemic. Originally, we planned to kind of review our findings with the caregivers to get their kind of okay on it, but as just as we were about to do that, everything started to shut down. So we're not sure about our ability to check in again with caregivers around us, considering the different stressors they're encountering. On top of that, we're kind of thinking about disseminating these findings to service providers, which we're hoping to do either in the summer, maybe the fall, depending on what's going on. And lastly, we're thinking of developing a parenting brief, which the team has started working on, that not only considers the needs for these families, but what does that mean in light of the xenophobia that's been affecting them and the pandemic. Can you go to the next slide, please? So, in asking parents about how they conceptualize parenting approaches, we need to understand why they would be doing these approaches. So we asked parents from the beginning, what are the things that they want for their children? What are their hopes and dreams? And we got a very holistic answer, which was very much in contrast to what we read in research, where predominantly people talk about this academic focus that occurs among Chinese immigrant parents. But for some parents, academics were not in any way their priority. They really wanted their children to be well-rounded, to be able to interact with peers, to be independent and be able to pursue their interests. Emotional well-being was very high on the list for many parents. They wanted their children to be happy, even if they weren't sure exactly what that happiness would look like. Caring for others and being somebody really engaged in civic engagement was very important for all of them, being sort of a member of the world and participating in that right. Filial piety was one that we have seen in research that shows up, and the hope that a child would become a dragon or a phoenix. So a dragon refers specifically for male children, and a phoenix for girls. And this focus of wanting their children to really succeed and to be out there and soar is something that a lot of parents talked about. Obedience was key, this idea of listening to your parents, following what your parents want for them, and making sure that you sort of kind of adhere to what is needed to keep the family going. Next slide, please. So in order to achieve this, we found the philosophy that parents had was Zhang Dali, the importance of teaching and reasoning with children to understand what their role is, to learn skills, to pursue academics, to become happy, and to engage in society. And a lot of parents talk about the reality of that. In talking about teaching and reasoning, they have to be very aware of the age of the children and what developmental stage they were in. In order to do this, they had different approaches. So modeling was key, which may look like, going to the store and bringing your children with them and sort of shopping with them and showing how to do that. Limiting potentially harmful activities. So an example of that is making sure that children were not too engaged in video games and ensuring that they were only kind of watching that for maybe an hour or less during the day. And this idea of getting children to cool down when they're upset, which almost every parent talks about. This focus on really having the children be able to take the time to calm themselves from emotional responses before engaging them, and at that point being able to reason with them. Really recognize that children need space at times to process their emotions, and that's okay. When asking parents about sort of harsh and abusive parenting, one of the things we encountered was that harsh and abusive is really difficult to translate into Chinese. So to describe harsh, we kind of refer to practices that may not be good for children. And for abusive, we talked about practices that may be cruel for children. We found that it was very difficult because this concept of harsh does not exist in Chinese language. It was difficult for parents at times to differentiate between harsh and abusive. But what we did see is that when they kind of move that practice more to abusive, they kind of focus on the intensity of the action as opposed to the actual action itself. Spoiling children was a theme that came across every single focus group. What parents were kind of focused on is that children were often given everything they wanted. They talked a lot about grandparents constantly catering to children, hand feeding them when they don't need to be the case. There was a huge concern about this, and a belief that because spoiling children prevents independence, that it was actually a harsh and potentially at times abusive practice. Overscheduling was another concern, that kind of giving too much stress to children and giving them too much to do, too many activities, could be detrimental for children. And there was a lot of concern around the caregivers at the table about that. Oh, and what I should mention is caregivers included a couple of grandparents, 2 fathers, and the rest were mothers. Inappropriate feeding was huge. There seemed to be a generational conflict between how to feed children, when they should get food, how much children should do themselves, whether it's okay for children to not eat if they don't want to. The conversation about hitting was a very delicate one. In some groups, parents kind of talked about, of course, hitting these bruises, but were very reluctant to indicate whether hitting occurred in Chinese communities, where some other groups were very vocal about the fact that this practice does happen, but talked about kind of the conflict between Chinese beliefs about hitting and American beliefs around hitting, as well as concern that they felt that their children were being sort of educated to speak out to the police if they were hit, and concerns about children kind of not quite understanding or not quite interpreting actions correctly and calling the police, which has a lot of ramifications for parents, especially thinking about immigration status. Emotional neglect was kind of really important, thinking about, how much support do you give the children? How much time do you really give children until it comes to the point of detecting the neglectful? Some parents really kind of wondered about that. Parental stress was something that parents felt kind of caused harsh parenting as well as abusive parenting, that people sometimes are really struggling and having a hard time. And as a result, they're likely to kind of engage in these harsh and abusive practices. We also asked parents about harsh and abusive Western practices, which parents had quite a bit to say about that. But the two things that we really found was that they felt that American parents give their children way too much freedom, to the point that there are times when children may be in danger and parents may not be aware of it. And they were too liberal, too permissive in what they allowed children to do. Next slide, please. And talking about contextual, the contextual piece, we asked about sort of the role of discrimination, and across the board, parents really felt that discrimination happened everywhere in this world. Now, this was prior to the pandemic, so I was actually really curious to follow up with parents and see their thoughts about discrimination now. But I think having the free kind of COVID perspective is really helpful. We found that bullying at school, being told back to China, and differential treatment in the community was sort of common discrimination or experiences. So the response to this discrimination really varied from parents not acknowledging, something happened to their children, not acknowledging it and just closing their child to make friends, ignoring it outright, kind of talking about it with their children and kind of processing what happened, giving their children extra care because they realize the hurtful impacts of discrimination. In the cases of fear of safety, it stepped up to kind of calling the police and in some cases confronting perpetrators. Next slide, please. So in terms of thinking about what parents felt were supportive characteristics in their community, they talked a lot about good government services, which unfortunately, because we didn't have a chance to follow up with parents, we didn't get to really break down what good meant. But they seemed appreciative of things sort of like WIC and food stamps and programs such as that. If their children have places to play in parks and basketball parks, as well as that there were churches providing sort of spiritual guidance for their children and their families. Things that were challenging was the difficulty of affordable housing, where in the communities that these parents lived in, there was a lot of gentrification that was occurring, and so people are kind of getting squeezed out of affordable housing. A concern about violence, which includes also sort of being exposed to marijuana, and as well as the accessibility of resources. So they knew that resources existed, but they weren't always accessible to them. Some of the recommendations that parents really had is that there was a need for kind of better play spaces. One set of parents talked about the fact that there were needles that were found on play stations and that there was play spaces, as well as a need that needed to be cleaned up, as well as a need for fencing. Better kind of often online dissemination of services by those in the community, so they knew they existed, but didn't always hear about it in a timely fashion or just felt like it wasn't actually there. Childcare was huge, as I think it is for everyone across the nation in terms of needing to have more places to send their children that's affordable. And really having more parent-child extracurricular activities, which parents said that sometimes they didn't understand why those activities were happening. They would appreciate some guidance around that. And of course, homework help for parents. Next slide, please. So lessons learned. I think that I've been really fortunate to have an amazing community partner. And sometimes something I really say all the time is like, it can only go down from here in terms of my partnerships with community organizations. I really felt it's a process where we learned how to be kind of equal researcher community organization partnership. And that was a key part of this. In every aspect, I felt it was important for BCNC to really be involved, and BCNC just stepped into the plate and provided sometimes even more than I expected. Making sure to do that when sometimes I think in academia we're encouraged to kind of just focus on the research perspective is something that, to really keep in mind and be very purposeful about. The complexity of translating Western parenting concepts, didn't really realize the complexity of that when I first started this project. And really talking with staff of BCNC through a mock focus group and getting feedback on focus group guides, as well as engaging with my team at VU, really helped us realize how difficult this is and gave us insight into what clinicians and policymakers face when they're trying to kind of communicate certain information, especially for child welfare services, so that there's situations where parents are being kind of accused of complicity in abuse. How do you even talk about that when abuse is not something that is naturally, kind of translated into Chinese? How do you explain those different things? We talk about harsh parenting and harsh parenting that may not be actually there. The cultural differences in communication norms is something that was also something that took a while to learn. In our focus groups, we found that people's body language said so much more at times than their actual words, and that the way that people may approach the answer may not be necessarily a direct answer, but kind of take a roundabout approach, which was kind of part of the culture, but essential for really understanding what may be underlying beneath those words. And lastly, I think, in talking with DCNC, thinking about how can research findings kind of really inform programming delivery. And there are times when we didn't even think what we had would be useful to some degree. So a recent conversation we had with Yoyo and another wonderful staff member, Grace, we were talking about, sharing some of the quotes we had around bullying and discrimination. And it turns out that the staff members are actually doing a webinar for parents while they're home on bullying. And so we have these quotes that we can translate into Cantonese and Mandarin that we're currently, hopefully, almost done with and sending out to them so that they can use that information. So sometimes the translation can go from small to big, and recognizing all those opportunities can be really important. And now I'm going to pass along to Yoyo.
Thank you, Judith. So could people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So BCNC is in multiple sub-organizations in the Greater Boston area. We have 4 locations. We serve people around 3,000 per year, but include our Power Art Center, we serve people around 7,000 per year, which is the large organizations in the Greater Boston area serve immigrant populations, especially for Asian populations. So we really partner with Judith Scott on this partnership on research about Chinese parenting, because not many researchers interested understand Chinese, how they do parenting. A lot of minority myths fall into the Asian American. They feel like they don't need the resources, they are academic, achieve really well, they are doing fine, but actually it's not. So we really appreciate the partnership with Judith Scott. So after Judith finished the research, we share with our staff. So internally, we have around 75 full-time staff. We will share what we learned through the research, parents' voice, how they view the parenting, and how we could work with our parents more effectively internally. So for externally, we want to communicate with the stakeholder like Department of Children and Family Head Start programs. On and off, they do a lot of referral to BCNC, ask us to serve this family, but sometimes we find some communications gap between the perceptions about Chinese culture and Western cultures. So I think this finding are really helpful to inform the stakeholders and partners how our Chinese parenting communicate with the majority people are slightly different. And also the perceptions how Chinese family to do the parenting within their home, and also face cultural differences externally. So we would like to identify the current service gap. So currently our family services are located at 2 locations, and we do a lot of weekly parenting group, parent cafe. Also we have like case management and also short-term counseling services. So we want to reassess whether our current service address the gap of in this finding. So we also talk to our family services staff in terms of how we deliver our programs. So in the past, we do a lot of very standardized evidence-based program, maybe not necessarily meet with all the family needs. They maybe feel more comfortable, have a drop-in, have a staff available to talk to them, or to hold a parent support group more often, to create a family center welcoming environment, also to other programs in our childcare unit as well. So the other things we think is very important is for our staff professional development and trainings under how we could serve our parents better and what kinds of services they need the most. And the other one is create a new programming to improve our existing program. So currently we're thinking about a lot of resources might not be necessarily available under the pandemic, how to respond, how to provide personal care, and also how to address racism in the community. So we are trying to explore whether we could translate some material from CDC and other webinar trainings and post on our WeChat, so our parents will be more easy to access those resources and address the equity issues. Next slide, please. So what we learned with this partnership, I think Judith and BCNC and Judith, her team have been very open communicate with BCNC staff. So we treat equally each other, and we really appreciate. Remember, Judith brought in her research team to do a mock testing for how we run focus group. So we have our FS staff involved and really address like the cultural differences, how people will articulate their questions in a different way, how they responded. So I thought that was really helpful, and have our family service staff have a buy-in. So when we recruit our family in the community, already build the trust, and I think that become a very smooth process between a CBO and researcher. And we also really appreciate understand parenting issues for a research perspective, because a lot of time when parents share the information, we don't feel it's solid ground. We could apply future fundings or advocate for their needs in the community. So I think have a research-based evidence program really support our service in the community. So as I say, provide evidence to educate funders, stakeholders, state agency. So we are planning probably in the fall, we will share this meeting with the state agency and also community partners in both locations, like the city of Quincy and city of Boston. So that's I could give that to Judith.
So just because I think we have a couple minutes, which I'm surprised by. We'll go up. But I think in the end, you know, thinking about how to disseminate this information during a time when so many service providers are really stressed out is sort of key in being sensitive to that, and how, you know, we're kind of taking information that was essentially just to kind of inform generally what the needs are for a community, and now kind of applying it, because these needs don't change due to a pandemic. As a matter of fact, they get enhanced. In a sort of a time like this. So how we translate this information to helping service providers during this time and making sure that families are really supported, I think is the next challenge that we have, but I look forward to kind of exploring and understanding with BCNC. Thank you, Doris Duke, for letting us do this and paying for it. Appreciate it.
Thank you both, Yoyo and Judith. This project is just so fascinating to me. We've gotten a couple questions. So one of them, Judith, is really specific, I guess specifically to you, but about finding appropriate research staff for the project. If you can speak to that a little bit, how you went about that, how that worked out.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. Because I had been doing work with BCNC, I already had some people that were working with us. So it started out with Shen, who has been doing much more work with this community and this organization than I did. And from then, it became this sort of like a snowball effect, right? Like for one person, you learn about another person from another person. I was fortunate. I actually taught a student, Callie, who has spent time in China and spoke Mandarin. And so I immediately asked her, you know, what can we actually do? Reached out to students that were in not only at BU, but also at Tufts, who had some expertise around this. And, you know, something that you find is when you start talking to people about this, people talk as well. And so through those connections, we ended up kind of getting also Yan Yi through a mentor, actually academic mentor for Doris Duke, ended up getting Jia Yi. And Jay Han came because he had heard about it from my doctoral student. And all of this, we ended up having kind of sort of mini interviews first and talking about, you know, what are the needs of the project, how fluent are they in the language. As a matter of fact, somebody that we originally had that was going to be doing translation realized, as we talked about the questions and the aims, that she would not be able to translate this information up in Cantonese, which is when she suggested her friend Yan Yi instead. And so from all that and constantly having sort of communications as well as having a very clear orientation that occurred over 2 sessions was where we kind of found that this is a team that really works, and they've been crucial to this. Without this project wouldn't have happened. I'm sending them on the line now. Hi, guys.
Great, thank you. We got a question about if you could speak a little bit more to how you recruited parents or recruited and screened parents or caregivers for the focus group.
Yeah, so recruitment was an interesting process. Luckily, we were able to start out with, working with the strong relationships that BCNC had. But, these topics are not ones where parents are leaping for joy to talk about abusive parenting. So it did take us some while to really connect. Luckily, through some connections from people that I know by being on the program committee at BCNC, as well as just researching every temple and community organization church that were out there in the greater Boston area and just sending information. We also made recruitment not just asking for a resource, but asking that, if they wanted to participate or learn about these resources later on down the line. And so when we do have a demonstration, all of those that help us recruit will be asked to participate and to be part of that project to gain from that. In terms of screening, this is where my staff came in key. There were mostly phone screenings that occurred. That were conducted via my staff in Mandarin or Cantonese. They were screened initially to determine especially low income was something that we became more nuanced for us, because even though many of these families may actually surpass the federal guidelines for poverty, in Boston, they're not rich. They're actually struggling. So we use the low income guidelines based on city and where they live to determine whether they actually fit into our study. But through that, we kind of developed a survey, which, I'm happy to kind of share, that not only captured the demographic information, such as when do they immigrant, how many children do they have, but also explored how much they understood of English in terms of writing, reading, because we felt that would actually help understand how they may be exposed to different values in their countries in which they're able to engage in English.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question is for both of you, and it's a similar question to what someone asked with Carly and May, which is how you connected. And Yoyo, also, it's so how you connected, but also for you, sort of why did you all, why did you want to do this project? If you could speak a little more about what your why the organization felt willing and motivated to partner with Judith.
So BCNC has a long history in the community. In the past, a lot of research approach to BCNC. We might say no, we might say yes, but John Lee is our CEO, and I truly he just stepped down at the beginning of January, but he and I believe deeply about how we could bring the voice of the parent, the voice of the community in an academic level, and also policy level advocacy for people in the community need. A lot of time, people see a community-based organizations as a service provider. They might not see they are the leader in the community and have a voice. So I think our belief of BCNC is very important to collaborate with academic researchers to understand what is happening on the ground, and we'll be able to inform the policy and advocacy for the community have the resources. So in the past, we have a partner with other institutions like UMass, University of Massachusetts, to study about satellite baby, which is a group of the parents or majority of immigrant parents. They don't have a child care access, and then end up they decide to send their children back to home, be raised by extended family. So that's a research be done in Boston area with BCNC, and also research I think in New York State. So so this is our second project, collaborate with researcher, especially Judith. And I think the niche about parenting, is not many people interested to study about parenting, but BCNC is very interesting to study parenting because we are family-centered approach organizations which identify to serve individuals, not only who they are, but also the culture they come from, the family they be raised. So that tell you a lot about how we do our family interventions. We deliver systems approach, how to make individuals have a better life, but you have to do family interventions. So I think this really aligns with what Judith envisions study about parenting.
So we connected to kind of being heard about they need a need for program evaluation. And so that's how, you know, in pursuing the program evaluation and working with the agency, is how I'd be able to understand, you know, what was the needs of the agency, what were the needs of the community, and also similarities that were there for some experiences I've had with working with various parents that I wasn't necessarily aware of. But the fact that there was this limited research kind of exploring the experiences of this community was something that really stood out to me so much. And talking with Yoyo and Giles and understanding that, like, that how do you get funding if you have no evidence to support that? And your anecdotal and very knowledgeable practice knowledge is not what is being accepted, right? Which isn't really right. So part of me feels like at this point, I'm simply the mechanism to help their already established knowledge and the knowledge of the families to be heard by funders and by policymakers, and hopefully continue to be that, you know, amplifier for them as opposed to being sort of their actual voice.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Yoyo and Judith. We are out of time for your section. We can ask some more questions later, but thank you. All right, we'll move now on to the final team, which is, I don't actually know which one of you all is going to talk. So it's Scott, Natalia, or Dan. So one of you all can take it away.
Thanks, Leanne. I'm going to try to get our slides up here. I'll be talking at least through the first portion, and then I think all four of us will be able to answer some questions. We each have sort of specific domain expertise that we might be able to lend to the question session. So, yeah, so I'm going to start by introducing our team, just as the others did, because you know, we were sort of a cohesive team, each contributing our own expertise. And I want to start initially by thanking Jessica Willis, who's online right now. She's from the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, which is to say that she is a public defender at heart. She's actually the special counsel to the Director for Forensic Evidence, which is to say that she is sort of deeply steeped in PDS's use of forensic evidence in the courtroom. And so what that means is that she has you know, experience in the courtroom representing indigent clients, but then she also has a bigger picture view about how the entire organization uses science. And so she's been in her office has been a really important touch point as we've proceeded through the last year of research. And then our other two team members, I think most of you will know quite well, Natalia Orange-Danes. She's at UCLA, she's a neuroscientist, and then Dan Busso. He's at Framework Institute, although was also trained in neuroscience as well, up at Harvard prior to his current position at Frameworks, where he works in science translation. So if you can see the next slide, please. I'll introduce our project and sort of what we sought to do. So our community partner, as I mentioned, is the Public Defender Service, and at the very outset, sort of before we submitted our application for this grant, we had worked with actually Jessica's predecessor to identify some of the challenges that they faced in their advocacy for youth. So I'm going to back up just for one quick second and emphasize that PDS represents both kids and adults, and even they even have a branch of their advocacy that works on behalf of youth in the community that may not have even touched the justice system. And it's important to remember that PDS is actually sort of probably the premier public defense organization in the United States, and they're very well funded, they're very sophisticated in their practice, and so that enables them to leverage some tools that other groups may not be able to at this point. So they're a really good entry into or a really good partner to develop new tools that which we can then make available to a wider audience. So their challenge that we had discussed with them over a year ago was that the science-based advocacy tools, specifically around the effects of poverty and adversity on brain development, were underdeveloped. And what I mean by that is that we're all familiar with this sort of brain architecture paradigm. It's been around for probably 20 years. It's been tremendously influential in practice and policy, and has really enabled a wide, broad swath of practitioners to access sort of otherwise complex neuroscience evidence. But it's also about 20 years old, and we've learned a lot since then, and it might need some updating. It's also meant primarily to explain sort of how brain development works in children. So, for example, it's used by a lot of folks, discussing 0 to 2 or preschool, and it's not immediately obvious that the clarity of the brain architecture translation is unvarnished when it's applied to adolescents. PDS represents adolescents and adults. We're specifically interfacing with them in the juvenile justice system, but these are not kids that are 3 years old, of course. And so the tools that we typically see that translate the neuroscience of child development for policymakers don't necessarily have the same power when we talk about adolescents. And actually, Dan might be able to speak later about his research on how people perceive adolescents as being different from children, and why that might matter when we're using these frames to translate the research. And then the third sort of reason that the advocacy tools might be a little bit underdeveloped is that the brain architecture tools and other types of metaphors are really effective at communicating how childhood adversity is embodied. Basically, how bad things or good things can change brain and behavior. There are relatively fewer tools that are of sort of the same flavor that can communicate what buffers the effects of these bad things and what might encourage resilience. So we wanted to essentially develop some tools that we could pass on to PDS that they might be able to use in their advocacy. And so our overall objective was both to research some of these questions around resilience and buffering, and then also translate them for their use. And so if we can go to the next slide, we can talk about our specific aims. We had 3 of them. 2 of them relate to research. And so when I say research, these are empirical analyses that Natalia and I conducted together. The first was focused on personal violence exposure, and I'll talk about what that means in a second. The second was focused on neighborhood violence exposure. The reason that we ended up drilling down on violence exposure is because we were broadly interested in explaining or investigating how experiences that are common in poverty, in childhood poverty, might affect brain development and behavior. But of course, we were also interested in figuring out what might buffer from those experiences. And violence exposure is among the most common and maybe among the most toxic types of exposures. Of course, violence can manifest in lots of different ways, including child maltreatment. But actually, for reasons that I'll get to in a minute, we didn't focus on violence perpetrated by parents. So our 2 research aims looked at different types of violence exposure, and then also different buffering mechanisms, primarily mechanisms that relate to the family environment, which I'll come back to and talk about why we selected those towards the end of this talk. And then, of course, we were interested in brain development and behavior. We're both looking at amygdala volume because that's a portion of the brain that is sort of central to threat perception and response and affective processes. There are, of course, other parts of the brain that are very, very important to the processes that we're interested in. but as a sort of marker, as a biomarker that reflects adversity and embodiment, as well as one that is involved in driving behavior. The amygdala ends up being a really nice target for research. And then our action aim was to use the expertise in frameworks the frameworks provides, and specifically Dan and his team, to communicate the neuroscience that frankly is just not going to be useful in the courtroom into a set of tools that is very useful in the courtroom. So we had a two-stage process set up. So on the next slide, I'm very briefly going to go through the results of our empirical work because there's lots to cover, and I actually think that for the sake of today, Dan's work on the translation is at least, if not significantly more so, more interesting and more applicable to our current efforts. But I just want to highlight some top-line findings from the first paper, and I'm going to explain real briefly what you see on the right in two small plots. Essentially, what we investigated was kids who were exposed to violence, and what that means is we asked moms if their children had ever essentially been beat up. Quite frankly, this was a Dutch study, it's a Dutch sample in Generation R, so about 3,000 kids. And we asked mom, when kids are about 10, has your kid ever experienced violence? And then we also asked mom at 10 about her how she perceives her family as functioning. Now, one nice thing about this family functioning measure is that it's agnostic to family structure. So we're not talking about gender roles or parenting roles. We're not even talking about parenting strategies. This is more a question about the extent to which families can solve problems. And what that means is that it's amenable to intervention quite easily because there's sort of a range of interventions that can teach problem solving strategies. So our moderator here is this family functioning measure. Our outcome in the top panel is a behavior problem measured by the child behavior checklist. These are as rated by partner parents. So these are dads, we have different reporters. And in the bottom panel, we have the objective measures from the MRI scan, which is amygdala volume. And effectively what you see is that as you move to the right on these plots, you get higher functioning, children of higher functioning families, and you see that the effects of violence exposure almost disappear among the highest functioning families, whereas among the lower functioning families, the effects are pretty dramatic. And so the application of this research is that we get some mechanistic insight into how programs supporting families might interact with the toxic exposures that are patterned by poverty. Now, we don't need a $600 brain scan, and we don't need somebody to stick their head in a magnet for an hour to know that that programs supporting families are helpful for children facing adversity. But by doing this research, we get some new mechanistic insight, which has scientific contributions in terms of measurement, but it also has translational benefits when we recognize sort of the persuasive nature of neuroscience in current policy thinking. So on the next slide, I'll very briefly talk about some of Natalia's research, which is very, very similar. This is in the ABCD study, which we've talked about previously. And this is actually a cohort of 11,000 kids. It's the largest neuroimaging sample in the country. And they'll be followed for 10 years. They started at about 9 or 10 years old. And I'm going to call this out specifically because this is a data set that should be of interest to many researchers in the fellowship. Leaving aside all of the neuroimaging data, which is fantastic, it's also a superb resource with deep phenotyping on behaviors, neuropsych outcomes, and the family environment. So just note that, put it away for future reference. And then, of course, if you have any questions about it, I would recommend contacting Natalia, who has been involved in data collection for ABCD out at UCLA. And what she found was essentially that kids exposed to neighborhood violence, and these were kids who self-reported that that their neighborhood was safe or not. They had neighborhood violence was also associated with differences in amygdala volume, and those differences were also moderated by a measure of caregiver emotional support. It basically, again, this is a question that was asked to kids. Is your caregiver a person who's able to make you feel better when you're upset? A measure that relates to their primary caregiver, but their results are broadly consistent. And so the insight here is that we get some sense of how programs developing caregiver skills, which is different than programs supporting families, might mitigate the effects of neighborhood violence. All right, so that's our empirical research. The third aim is on the next slide relates to the work that Frameworks did. And this is where things sort of get really interesting. So just to recap, we had talked about this previously, I think last year, but Frameworks does this translation research, and it's empirical, and they basically had these peer discourse sessions. So these are focus groups, but they're more than that, because they don't just ask how people feel about certain social issues. They also ask, or they also sort of study how groups interact, and how groups either accept or reject different types of communication strategies. And so Dan and his team ran 3 of these focus groups or peer discourse sessions in Washington, D.C. There are 6 participants in each session. They were 2 hours apiece. The photo that you see is actually from one of the peer discourse sessions. And essentially what they did was they asked questions about juvenile justice and how the public sort of saw issues that relate to justice reform. And then they also tested some of the metaphors that they thought might be useful in translating our research for PBS's use. And so if we can go to the final slide, we talk about some of the key findings. So it's worth noting right now at the outset that in a perfect world, we would want to be able to take our findings from Generation R and from ABCD, the empirical work, and use them directly in our translation piece for PBS's use. But of course, there's a broad body of literature that we needed to synthesize. And so talking with Dan and leveraging some of the research that he had done previously, we sort of realized that it did make a tremendous amount of sense to see how the public responded to very specific single studies. And so instead, they focused on identifying some broad themes about how the public saw sort of brain development and adolescent juvenile justice. And through these peer discourse sessions, they identified sort of 4 big challenges to public thinking. And by that we mean commonly held beliefs that the public had that were maybe unproductive toward constructive reform efforts. So the first is this idea that crime is a rational decision, that all kids are making sort of some cost-benefit analysis before they do everything that might bring them in contact with the juvenile justice system. The second was the notion that fair sentencing meant that everybody was treated exactly the same based on sort of what they did in some sort of context-free description. And so I think for the peer discourse sessions emphasized that folks really had a hard time agreeing on what fair meant. And so that was a challenge that they identified that needed to be surmounted. The third is what they call the family bubble, and I'm an asterisk by this, which I'll come back to at the very end, one of our lessons learned. Family bubble is just that oftentimes the public sees juvenile or adolescent development as sort of a function of the parents and of the family. And so if the kid does something sort of antisocial or that brings them in contact with the justice system, it's the parents' fault, the family's fault. And then of course there's fatalism. And Dan and his team saw a lot of fatalism, basically saying, there's just no way to reach better outcomes. And so Dan can talk more about the strategies that they're thinking of that would be most successful to be sure that you emphasize when communicating to the public about the neuroscience and the neuroscience contribution to juvenile justice and reform efforts. And I really am going to let him talk because some of the stuff is a little bit technical, but he found that emphasizing values, sort of core values of justice and equity, resonate with the public broadly, and that they generally don't create too much dissonance among maybe otherwise disagreeing members of the public. The other one to highlight is just don't get caught in the fairness trap. I think we've all kind of seen this. Fair means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and so it ends up being an unproductive frame for communication. So that brings me to the last little bit about next steps. or rather lessons learned and next steps. And the first lesson that I want to highlight relates to that asterisk next to the family bubble. So when forming the project, we actually worked closely with PDS to define the scope of our research. And one of the primary requests that PDS made was that we didn't just research how poverty and other forms of adversity change kids' brains in bad ways. We know these things, it's really not that helpful. And so they sort of demanded that we also look into what works, or what works to buffer the effects of early adversity, because when they're in the courtroom, they need to know what works. And so after Nat and I sort of considered the literature and the landscape of leading edge interventional services, I think which often focus on building parent capacities more than on therapeutic interventions for kids, we looked at the buffering capacity of the family environment. That's why I looked at family functioning, and Nat looked at caregiver support. And that's how we landed on the research aims that we discussed. So, but then later, after we did our research, we passed these things off to Dan, and he and his team at Frameworks had these peer discourse sessions, and it turns out that they found that this family bubble thinking, that this emphasis on that the family is the definitive explanation for delinquency, if you will, is actually a challenge to public thinking when we're talking about reform efforts. So we ended up doing some research that might exacerbate one of the challenges that they face. And now, this can have some consequences. I'm a social epidemiologist by training, so my instinct is to retreat to investigating systems level interventions, like paid family leave. But paid family leave, right, might support caregivers in a much more effective way. But at the same time, PDS isn't going to walk into a courtroom and advocate for paid family leave as a component of their client's case disposition. So there has to be a balance between how we do this. But in any case, the lesson learned, the reason I bring this up is because it's sort of amusing and frustrating in a certain way. But it's that this was a really good reminder that we need to think through how research is going to be used at the earliest stages of developing a new research agenda. And we can do that through conversations both with folks at like Jessica at PDS, who have this sort of deep knowledge, and also folks like Dan who have the translational expertise. So this is like sort of a glaring lesson learned. It's like we just did this research that actually might not be incredibly useful because it risks exacerbating useful in translation because it risks exacerbating one of these challenges. The second lesson learned, and then for the third one, I'm going to pass it off to Natalia because she has some interesting insights. The second lesson that we learned was that we were incredibly fortunate to partner with the Public Defender Service. I mentioned at the outset that they are one of the premier organizations, if not the premier public defense organization in the country. And their attorneys are outstanding. They have deep knowledge about how science gets used in the courtroom. And the reason that they have this knowledge is because they're in the courtroom. That's great. It's unbelievably helpful, right? At the same time, they're in the courtroom. And so, Jessica can tell you that scheduling calls was really difficult. Once you're on trial or once you're preparing for trial, your life is subsumed for a month or more. And so it was a challenge to leverage their deep expertise, in part because their deep expertise was being applied so frequently. So that's just something that we'll have to keep in mind as we move forward. And as we move forward, that would be the next step. So we'll continue to work on dissemination, like some of the other teams. Our dissemination efforts were derailed a little bit by COVID, or comprehensively by COVID, but that's the way it goes. So that's all I have. The third thing, the third lesson learned, I'm going to pass off to Natalia because she spent a lot of time on this specific lesson. But after talk, perhaps we'd love to answer some questions either about Dan's research or the empirical results. So Natalia. Who may or may not be having audio difficulties. So I'll just while we wait, I'll just go ahead and tell you what I was going to say. Lessons learned were grant management challenges. So our grant was administered through UCLA, and Natalia's efforts, heroic efforts, coupled with, quite frankly, Leanne and Debs and everybody else at Shape in the Halls, to get the grant moving in, were impose a burden that we didn't expect. I can't tell you how much time that Natalia spent working with our grant management folks on a logistics. We were ready to do the science, we were ready to do the translation. I think we were caught off guard by the burden that the grant, just the administrative stuff, imposed. And so when she gets her audio back, she can fill things in. But with that, I open it back up to you. I do want to be mindful and thankful of Jessica's presence, but also sort of mindful of her time, in part because she was on trial frequently over the last several months, and then also with COVID, they've been advocating for essentially to get the clients out of jail because they're at a deep risk. And so I assume, Jessica, you're exhausted and fatigued, and so I don't want to put you on the spot too much for lessons learned. So I think maybe instead we'll just answer whatever questions the rest of the group might have.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate all of that. And Jessica, you may not be surprised by this, but the first question that we got was really if you could talk a little bit about what your motivation was to participate in this partnership, and what your hopes are for what the next steps are for the dissemination of the research with your staff or your stakeholders, judges or attorneys or whoever you consider your stakeholders to be.
Right. So I think that one frustration that we've had systemically throughout the sort of different types of practice we have is the lack of understanding on the part of judges about juvenile brain development and how that should factor into questions of culpability, for example, and how they should consider that when we present mitigation to them in its various forms. So whether that's with a kid who's pre-trial and we're trying to get him home and explain the unique kind of harm that the pre-trial detention is doing for this child, or if it's in a case where we have a 16, 17, 18-year-old or 16, 17-year-old who's charged as an adult and is not in the juvenile system and is facing a sort of unapologetically punitive and overly carceral sort of system, how we present mitigation and questions of culpability in that context. We really it's exactly what Scott was just talking about. It's like where we're dealing with a bench, right, who has this sort of terrifying amount of power over this child's fate, that is sort of saying, well, he's good egg, bad egg. Johnny, you did this because you wanted a pair of new shoes, and I'm going to teach you a lesson, and that's not okay. And I'm this stern father figure, and I'm sending you to jail because I care about you, right? And what do you do against that to combat that sort of sense? And being a forensic, a person who thinks a lot about marshaling science on behalf of our clients in the courtroom, this was sort of a gap in our practice. We're really good at talking about DNA to judges and juries. We're not nearly as good about talking about this particular sort of question of how this kid's exposure to family or neighborhood violence or poverty sort of should factor into the set of decisions that we're asking judges, prosecutors, wardens, people like that to make. And so I think that there is a deficit in our expertise as direct service providers and advocates. And so that's sort of, I think, to answer the first question. And then in terms of, and I hope I haven't forgotten the second question, but in terms of deployment sort of this research and where we see it going, I mean, I think Scott mentioned this, frankly, I need to talk to them a little bit more about sort of how they think this can be most helpful, and to kind of loop back in with frameworks and get a better understanding, a more detailed understanding myself of the findings from the focus group, because as Scott mentioned, I was in a murder trial for 2 months, and it's really hard to it's impossible to multitask. So that is what it is. That's a part of the system that we're working within. But I think there's sort of 3 categories, and one is what I've been discussing the most, which was, I think, the initial impetus, which was courtroom advocacy in all of its forms for our differently situated clients. We have clients in juvenile court, and we're speaking to a certain set of values and statutory requirements there. Our kids who are charged as adults. And then a third category, which I think is something that has probably maybe the most potential for impact, which is the advocacy we're doing for clients who've been in prison for decades who were convicted as juveniles. And a lot of, because there's a new law in DC, it's about a year, 2 years old, called the Incarceration Reduction Act. It's IRA for short. And a lot of our IRA advocacy is petitioning the court for clients who are in their 50s and 60s, sometimes 70s, convicted of very, very serious crimes when they're 16, 17. And a lot of what we do, in addition to just sort of talking about them and who they are and why they should deserve a chance to not die in prison, is sort of the trauma, both sort of emotional, psychological, but then also the neuroscience aspect of that could be really nice to incorporate into that advocacy. And that's a forum where we're already kind of telling a developmental story, and we could really strengthen that story with this kind of hard science. It is really easy and tempting to kind of slide into platitudes when you talk about kids' culpability, or you tell like a mitigation story about someone who committed a crime when they were 16 and is now 50. And judges, there's like I don't know if this happens in other sort of types of work, but people talk about empathy fatigue in our work. And I think having some hard data to support the request for empathy can be particularly powerful. So those are the sort of the categories of deployment of this research that we've been discussing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We had another question specifically for Natalia, but I don't think she's on yet. So we'll just, we will wait on that. The next question, and this was for Dan. Sorry. Oh, hey, yay,
hi,
welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear us?
Good. Yes, I'm sorry. I don't know. I had to like re-sign back in, and I don't know what was happening.
It's totally fine. I'm still like not uncrossing my fingers for how well everything is going with technology so far on this. So Natalia, this was specifically for you, just about the ABCD study. Is data collection still happening, and is it accessible? Can people use it, or how does that work?
Oh yes, it is publicly accessible. There is this website. It's just basically NDAR, like N and then DAR, and then you have to essentially sign up through your university, fill out like a data use agreement, but then yes, you have access to all of the data. And then even if you don't have like the bandwidth to support the raw imaging data, there are metrics where basically the data informatics core at UCSD, that's like the main kind of like the central ABCD head, they have already analyzed some of the imaging data to give you, common metrics. So like, volume of like key regions. So yeah, so it's all on there and available.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. I have one other question that came in for, and this is for Dan. And then, so if anybody has other questions for any of the teams, you can just send it in the chat. But Dan, is Dan on? Dan's on here, right?
I am. Can you hear me?
There you are.
Oh, good.
We can hear you. Thank you. So one question was just if you could talk a little bit more about, let me read what it says. In the slide about the key findings, when you talk about using values of justice and equity to make the case for systems reform, the question is really, is that sort of the counterpart or the counter argument to the fairness issue, that it's context free? If you could just talk a little bit more about that, that would probably answer the question.
Yeah, I think so. So I think there's kind of two conceptions of fairness that people tend to work with. One of which, as Scott mentioned, was just this sort of more universal understanding of fairness, which is everyone gets the same thing. The other kind of fairness, I think, is much closer to what we would understand as equity, which is to recognize that there are different needs, different circumstances, different types of upbringings and experiences that would dictate different types of treatment within the justice system. And so the idea is to really foreground the fact that the justice system should work for everyone, regardless of their race or their income or the community that they grew up in, and can be attentive to those individual differences when it comes to decisions around sentencing or how they should move through the system to begin with.
Okay, thank you. So this is the time right now for general questions. We just have a few minutes left. So I actually probably only have time for this one question. So let me ask this, and then if one person from each team, we can just go in order, Carly, Judith, and Scott. If you think back to the beginning of the project, and your first conversations with your research and project partners, what is the one thing, what is the biggest benefit from this work that you didn't anticipate or that you weren't expecting? And actually, any of the policy partners could also answer this question. Judith, you're up. Why don't you go?
I think you're muted.
Yeah, Judith, you're muted, I think.
Oh, sorry, I thought Carly was going first and I got a little distracted. Could you just quickly repeat the question?
That's okay. What is the one, what is the biggest benefit did you get from this project that you weren't anticipating?
Oh. Wow. I think getting the perspectives of Julia as a public health person, Bridget as a clinical psychologist, the people in my team who are of the community, as well as my partners, all of their perspectives made my understanding of this so much more complex and made me realize how much more I need to know about things.
So thank you for the extra minute, Judith, because I was not sure how I would respond, because that is a big question. I learned that I would never throw a conference again. But the biggest thing that I actually got out of this was really recognizing and having the opportunity to continue the partnership that I believe allowed me to actually get my federal grant to continue to work with these partners. While it's not focused specifically on housing, it's still focused on CSEC. And I do feel that having the ongoing presence, and you're still in these people's faces because it's easy to be forgotten about as a researcher sometimes, sometimes. And so I think that just ongoing connection really allowed for even more work in the future.
Great, thank you. Scott?
Yeah, I think having the combined expertise of three other folks who really do come at the same problem that we all care about from very different angles was instructive, and you know, we all bring our own backgrounds to the research, and I think that we believe in our research and that it can have impact on its own, but you know, working with frameworks, first of all, is always eye-opening, and I've been a big fan of their efforts for some years now, but you know, having the privilege of speaking at length with Dan was eye-opening because just as a reminder that I have huge blind spots in how our work is perceived. And then having the opportunity to speak not just with Jessica, but some of the people, some of the folks that she works with on her team, was also helpful because you know, again, we sort of think that our research can answer all of the questions, or at least a lot of them, and that, you know, our papers are going to be the ones that are influential. And yet, when we have those, you know, outside voices and eyes that can speak and cast a skeptical light, I think the questions that we ask get much better. It sounds a little bit cliche, but honestly, having those different perspectives was just so eye-opening. Even though we already knew that they were going to be helpful, it was much more helpful than I would have imagined. Great.
Okay, great. Thank you. We did have one or two more questions, but I know we're out of time. So again, thank you to all of you and to Jessica and Yoyo and May for joining us today and for participating in this pilot project. We've learned a lot, and we appreciate their generosity with talking with me and with giving us some insight into how these projects have gone and how we can improve them. So just to wrap it up, we are really hopeful that we will have funding for future rounds. We won't know for sure until probably the end of September about that. So we will continue to give you information as we find out more. I know I speak for everybody to please reach out to any of the presenters from today. The information showing on the webinar, or you can always reach out to Nikki or me with questions, and we can connect you with the right person. And then the last thing is the teams are still working on all of their dissemination strategies. And so you all, I'm sure, will post that and disseminate those once they're available. I want to say one last thank you again to Nikki for pulling all of this together today. It was a lot of work, so really appreciate her efforts to make everything go smoothly today. I hope everybody is doing well, staying safe and healthy, and reach out if you have any questions or needs. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.